The first transcontinental railroad was a triumph in American history that connected us all and fueled the American manifest destiny.
The men who built the railroad spent long, hard days to try to connect the U.S., some even losing their lives.
Railroads changed the way we looked at transportation forever. They changed a 5-month trip into a 5-day trip, making the world, in a way, smaller.
Railroads helped the Union win the Civil War, but this was at the cost of the countless Native Americans who were stripped from their land to build the railroads.
Without the railroads, America might not be the way we see it today.
The railroads provided many benefits. They revolutionized the way we transport goods today. The man who invented the first steam locomotive was George Stephenson. He was the first to successfully make the first working locomotive. When people first heard about his new invention, they were amazed that it saved between 60 and 70% on shipping compared to carriages. Americans thought it would be a great idea to build some of them in the US, so we did.
One of the main items they shipped was kerosene, which is a refined oil used for lamps and lights. Railroads also transported people from one place to another in a shorter time and for a cheaper price than using a horse. Although railroads had many benefits, they also had some difficulties. The railroad caused one of the first ever monopoly schemes. Although the railroad was not directly the cause, it was an important factor. Without the railroad, John Rockefeller, the one brave kerosene manufacturer, probably would not have become rich enough to buy almost all the kerosene factories in the U.S.
The Transcontinental Railroad was one of the main railroads that built America. When the idea of a transcontinental railroad first came up, people thought it would be impossible to make such a big railroad, but people like the Big Four, Theodore Judah, and Abraham Lincoln thought it could be done. Congress sponsored many people to find a route for the Transcontinental Railroad, and there was one person up for the task, Theodore Judah.
Theodore Judah was a civil engineer who was mesmerized about the thought of a transcontinental railroad. He had come up with a route for the railroad, but it was too difficult. One day in 1859, he got a letter from a man from California named Daniel Strong, offering to show Judah a route along an old immigrant trail. This route was much better. It only required them to pass the summit of one mountain. Judah was happy with the route and started looking for investors. He found a group of businessmen from Sacramento that were up for the challenge. They were later called the Big Four. Their names were Collis P. Huntington, Mark Hopkins, Charles Crocker, and Leland Stanford. They quickly started paying Judah to survey the land to show Congress in October 1861. Many weren't sure if it was a good idea to spend so much money on a project, especially during the Civil War, but Abraham Lincoln signed a paper for the Pacific Railroad Act on July 1, 1862, authorizing land grants and government bonds to the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads.
Each section would later connect to make the first transcontinental railroad, connecting Sacramento, California to Omaha, Nebraska, and the already existing Eastern U.S. rail network. Both railroads competed to see who could lay the most tracks the fastest, but each railroad had its own geological features. The Central Pacific Railroad went through mountainous terrain, while the Union Pacific Railroad went through the plains rather than the mountains. The companies were paid by the mile. You would think that the Union Pacific would make more money than the Central Pacific, but that just isn't the case. They received $16,000 for laying over flat land, $32,000 for laying over hill country, and $48,000 for laying over mountainous terrain. In the end, they made about the same amount of money, but they didn't lay the same amount of tracks.
In 1865, the Central Pacific Railroad was at a shortage of workers, because all of the white Americans had gone to work in gold mines. The Central Pacific needed at least 5,000 workers, but they had much less than needed. So they resorted to hiring Chinese immigrants, but to the disliking of many. To the company's surprise, the Chinese immigrants turned out to be harder workers than their white American counterparts, even though they got paid less. They got $5 less, but they also got better food than the white Americans, who received $35 a month. The railroad also hired the Irish, but they primarily hired the Chinese. The Chinese first came to America because of the gold rush, but the Chinese who didn't find gold were looking for jobs, and the Central Pacific was hiring. The Chinese ate food like rice, tea, fish, and vegetables, which was in some ways better than what the white Americans ate. This made them healthier and made it so they could work harder and longer than the white Americans. However, the number of workers was not the Pacific's biggest struggle.
It was the tunnels. One tunnel that stands out the most is the Summit Tunnel. The Summit Tunnel was projected to take around 3 years to finish, but to try to split this time in half, the Central Pacific came up with a clever plan to dig two opposite sides of the mountain and meet in the middle. Even with this, they wanted to go even faster, so they resorted to using black powder. Black powder is a very dangerous mixture that can explode at the slightest spark or impact. In one such instance, they had received a shipment of black powder, and while opening the shipment, it exploded, killing 6 people. There were many deaths here in this tunnel and in many others. This made the way for the creation of TNT that is used even today. Even with all these challenges, the tunnel was finished in less than 2 years. This can be attributed to the hard work of the Chinese immigrants of the time. The Central Pacific managed to finish only laying 690 miles of track.
Even though the Union Pacific was on flatter land than the Central Pacific, this doesn't mean it was without its struggles. The Union Pacific didn't have troubles with their amount of workers, for they were primarily white Americans, but they did have Native American troubles. The Union Pacific was built over Native American land, which meant the Union workers were in constant danger of Native American attacks. The Native Americans were mad about the mass killing of buffalo and the fact that the railroads were taking their land. Buffalo were killed by the hundreds because people were sent out to kill the buffalo so they wouldn't interfere with the construction of the railroad or get in front of trains. A place that was once teeming with buffalo now had less than half its former self. The Native American attacks got so bad that the U.S. Army was deployed to protect the workers and the railroads. The Native Americans only managed to kill, as they call, a couple of iron horses.
One of the bridges that the Union Pacific made was the Dale Creek Bridge. It was the longest bridge that the Union Pacific constructed. A bridge like it had never been built before because it had never been necessary, but the weight and speed of the trains called for it. Most bridges before this one had just been for carriages and people, but these bridges were not strong enough. A new method of building bridges had to be developed. A man named William Howe had a patented truss design that was like no other. Both the Union and Central Pacific Railroads began using the design. The bridge was first made of wood, but then later replaced with metal. This metal's frame swayed in the wind, so they helped support it with ropes. Once the bridge was done, it was the only one of its kind. Even with these challenges, the Union Pacific managed to lay almost 2 times the amount of rails than the Central Pacific. In the end, the Union Pacific laid 1,086 miles of track.
In the end, the two railroads met, and there was a big festival celebrating the connection of the Pacific to the Union Pacific Railroad. At the Promontory Summit, people decorated the cars. 2 train engines, the Jupiter and the N119, went tip to tip. A golden spike was hammered into the ground, signifying the connection of the two railroads and the connection of America. Telegraphs went out to the president saying the railroad was done. The first transcontinental railroad was born, and America was never the same.
After this, railroads sprung up all over the country, connecting America. Our economy blossomed. It took less time to travel, but most importantly, it taught us to try new things, even if people thought it was impossible.